All right, welcome everyone, and thanks for coming to our annual regulatory evening. My name is Amanda Leon, and I'm the sales manager over our division and also the regulatory services division. So we do this every year, and it's something that's really exciting for us, so I hope you find it informative and think of some good questions. We'll have questions after each presentation. So one sec.
We're doing the music.
Oh, okay. So this year we are doing lessons learned in 2018, going through some of the current regulations and what we learned, so hopefully we can share that with you so you can bring it back to your workplace and use it. Our first speaker is Ben Schellinger. Ben's been a regulatory specialist here with us for the last 4 years. He holds a certification as an SDS and label registered professional and is a member of our regulatory consulting team. Ben holds a Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry from the University of Minnesota. So let's welcome Ben. All right. We got it?
Yeah.
Do you need this or not?
Can I use that one?
Okay.
Yeah. Is there a way to move this thing off the way? That little guy.
Oh, yeah. Here you go. Here's yours.
Sweet. Okay. Cool. All right. So hi, my name is Ben Schellinger. I'm a regulatory specialist here at Pace Analytical, and today I'll be talking to you about Proposition 65 and the challenges regarding the new clear and reasonable regulation. Proposition 65 as a regulation is a straightforward and simple one. However, the process can be made difficult when upstream entities are not prepared and withhold information. In these cases, expert knowledge and professional judgment are required for proper assessments. Not close enough? Okay. Good now? Sweet. Okay, so first, background into Proposition 65. Proposition 65 was adopted by California voters after it appeared on the ballot in November of 1986 election. The measure required warnings before exposing any person to chemicals known to the state of California to cause cancer or reproductive toxicity. The proponents of Proposition 65 set out to keep known toxins out of the drinking water, require warnings to the public before any exposure to toxins, allow private citizens to enforce the measures in court, and require government officials to notify the public when illegal discharges of toxic waste can pose a serious risk to public health. Proposition 65 also included a bounty hunter clause, which allowed law firms and other special interest groups to bring cases up that are not brought by the state of California and allow them to collect a percentage of the litigations resulting from. All right, so the Proposition 65 list is published by the state and is a list of chemicals known to cause cancer or reproductive harm. California's Office of Health and Hazard Assessments, or OEHA, adopts the required list. OEHA evaluates all available scientific information on substances on the Proposition 65 list, and it updates it roughly every 6 months. The last one just happened last week. So companies doing business in California are required to label the products in areas like workplaces and apartments that contain or release significant amounts of these chemicals. Businesses are prohibited from knowingly releasing listed chemicals into the drinking water sources. All right, so on August 30th of 2016, the Office of Administrative Law approved the adoption of the amendment of Article 6, Clear and Reasonable Regulations, under the Title 27 of California Code of Regulations known as Proposition 65. There was a 2-year transitional period when both labels were allowed to be used in California, and then as of August 30th of this year, the amendment went into full effect. The amendment includes a clarification of retailers and manufacturers, as well as responsibilities, which we will discuss later, as well as new safe harbor language, and will be used in clear and reasonable warnings under Proposition 65. Okay. So the new Proposition 65 has a safe harbor language, and basically company use the guidance under this material. The safe harbor language is the type of insurance, meaning a company doesn't have to use the labels, but in order to prevent litigations against the companies, they're allowed to put on these labels, and basically, so a company does not have to use the safe harbor language, but it is recommended just because otherwise safe harbor, the type of insurance does not have to use the labels. However, it does have safe harbor, it does contain the requirement information under Proposition 65. So companies can choose to use the labels, which contain more information with the same amount of information as the safe harbor labels. However, they cannot contain less information than what's provided on safe harbor labels. So under the new Proposition 65 label, the word warning must be in all capital letters in bold print. The safe harbor language includes the product can be exposed to a chemical known to the state of California, the name of public, which is known to the state of California to cause cancer, or for reproductive toxins, this product can expose you to a chemical known to the state of California to cause birth defects or other reproductive harm. So a few important things to note on these labels. First is that you do require to list at least one substance that causes cancer or reproductive harm. And second, the word exposure must be listed. And priorly, you can just say that it contains a public to California to cause reproductive harm or cancer. But now you are required to actually label it, as well as for exposure, you now have to use the word exposure. So labels must also include the OEHA website, as well as a warning symbol, an equal triangle with an exclamation point. Consumer products may use an abbreviated on product label, which includes a warning symbol and a shortened exposure type statement in the website. So here's an example of both the new full label, as well as the on product label, which causes certain reproductive harm. So while the regulation does not define on-product labels, in the final statement of reasoning from OEHA, on-product refers to the public itself as well as any sort of media container, box, or wrapper, and does not include any other types of labeling. So full product labels would be any printed graphic or electronically provided communication that accompanies a product, including tags, a point of sale, or display of product. Under the new revision, the required size must also be the same size as any other warning material on the label, or a minimum of 6-point font. So here's a few examples of the new labels. What you'll notice first, the first one is actually based off the old product labels. I included that one as well as the new, based off the new August 30th regulation. Basically because I kind of like to show the difference between the two. So as you can see on the first one, it says detectable amounts of chemicals known to the state of California to cause cancer, birth defects, or other reproductive harm may be found in the facility. While in the second one, the wording actually includes the word exposure. You've got the pictogram, the capital letter for warning, and it reads, breathing the air in the parking garage exposure can cause you to chemicals including carbon monoxide, gasoline, or diesel engine exhaust, which is known to the state of California to cause cancer or birth defects or other reproductive harm. So you can kind of see the word exposure is also included as well as the website. So this kind of gives you an idea. And the very last one is just in the third example. Certain foods and beverages sold or served here can expose you to chemicals including acrylamide in many fried and baked foods, and mercury in fish, which is known to the state of California to cause cancer, birth defects, or other reproductive harm. For more information, then you visit the website. So it's basically just, these are what you would find in California for different workplace exposures. Speaking of exposure, so safe harbor levels exemptions do exist in Proposition 65. It is possible for a business to be exempt from Proposition 65 if it is determined that there is no significant risk of exposure to listed chemicals. The no significant risk is defined as a level of exposure that would result in not more than 1 in 100,000 chance of case of cancer, individuals exposed to over a 70-year lifetime. In other words, a person of a chemical at the no significant risk level for 70 years will not have more than 1 in 100,000 chance of developing cancer as a result of the exposure. So California has already, OEHA has determined no significant risk levels, or NSRLs, for many cancer-causing chemicals, and maximum allowed dose levels, or MADLs, for chemicals of reproductive toxicity. Exposure levels, discharges to drinking water sources that are below these safe harbor levels are exempt from the requirements of Proposition 65. As well, it's important to note that the NSRLs and MADLs are calculated in micrograms per day. It's not a product weight percentages, meaning that in order to determine if it's to do a safe harbor assessment, you need to actually perform an exposure scenario, which is a complex tautological analysis, as we will see later. So including, as well as different labeling, there has also been a change in liability under the new Proposition 65. So under the new Proposition 65, regulation burden is minimalized on downstream retailers. Burden of supplying Proposition 65 compliant labels has been put onto upstream entities such as suppliers, manufacturers, producers, packagers, importers, and distributors. If the retailer fails to pass on the, so retailers are only held liable for failure to supply under specific circumstances. If the retailer fails to pass on the warning or obscures the warning given to it by an upstream entity, if the producer product is a house brand or the retailer knowingly caused the listed chemical to be added to the product, or if the retailer had actual knowledge of the potential exposure to a listed chemical, there's no better party to hold liable. So the new regulation does allow upstream entities to shift responsibility back to retailers by providing proper and compliant notices and warning materials to the downstream retailers. The notice must be renewed with receipt, either electronically or in writing, by the retailer within 6 months of effective date, then annually thereafter that. Notices are required within 90 days if the Proposition 65 label has changed, either by composition or hazards. And this section is important to note, this section only does cover agreements between retailers and upstream entities. So it does not cover to non-retailers. The notice also must state that the product requires an internet warning if it is to be sold or may be sold online. And this brings us to the next major change of Proposition 65, which is the internet warning. As of August 30th, retailers are now required to label their products sold online for Proposition 65. Retail sellers are responsible for placement and maintenance of the warning materials, including warning for the products sold over the internet. However, as stated earlier, it is the responsibility of upstream entities to provide the warning material. The warning must be provided on the product page or a clearly marked hyperlink of all caps and bold with the word warning, which would then bring you to the Proposition 65 warning statement. The warning must be placed in a way which clearly associates the warning with the products containing the hazardous ingredients. The wording on the website can be either provided for the on-product, the same warning that's provided on the product. So for example, if a company is using an on-product label, the hyperlink can bring you to the same on-product label on the website as well. And this is an example of what you would expect to see for Prop 65 for internet warning. What you would expect to see is the product details on the right side, and on the left side would most likely be the picture of the product they're selling. And the hyperlink will then bring you to either the on-product or full product label. So for the minute of time, I'd like to talk about a certain case study for a company that we dealt with. The company we'll be focusing on specializes in lighting and cooking fuel items for restaurants, like lamps, candles, and chafing fuel products. Due to the diversity of products, their catalog, majority of which consisted of non-chemical or solid goods, with vendors which were not familiar with chemical regulations, the client needed assistance with organizing their products information and gathering enough composition information in order to make a Proposition 65 evaluation. So this flowchart shows kind of the typical process for Proposition 65 compliance. In an ideal situation, first all available data is gathered, including safety data sheets, tech data sheets, and product data sheets. Then vendors are contacted to fill in any missing information, and then all data is interpreted, and finally labels are implemented. In general, it usually takes about 80% of our time and energy to gather the data and contact any sort of vendors for any sort of missing information, while then the second two steps for interpreting data and implementing labels maybe only take about 20%. It's usually where the technical knowledge is required. So in this case, the client we will be focusing on had unique challenges during several steps of these, where technical knowledge and professional judgment were needed. So we started by processing by looking at all available data for each product, evaluating safety data sheets, tech data sheets, and other pieces of information we could find on each product. The goal being to determine how much composition information was readily available. If we had 100% composition, the product was cleared for evaluation. If composition information was missing, we checked if statements were available, which confirmed that no Proposition 65 components were contained within the material, in which case we were able to clear the product as well. Keeping in mind that as of August 30th, the actual list didn't change, only just the labeling requirements, as well as any sort of responsibilities. Products were flagged for follow-up if no statement was available, or products were confirmed to contain a Proposition 65 chemical and the composition was incomplete. In this case, we came up with a higher than average deficit in information, mostly because we had entire lines of products which were considered hard goods. So the same information that we would get from a chemical company may not be present, such as safety data sheets. In some cases, the only starting information we were given was what the name of the product was, so we knew we had a lamp, for example. In some cases, the only starting, at this point, we needed to start contacting vendors. So in order to help streamline the process, prioritization became important. We first determined key products which should be focused on first, disregarding any products which are already known to contain Proposition 65 chemicals for both cancer and reproductive hazards. Second, we determined key vendors which may be in multiple products or which supplied multiple products. After receiving responses from the vendors, documentation became important. All emails sent and received, as well as phone calls, were filed. All statements on Proposition 65 were requested in writing by email, and the responses during the vendor contact usually start pretty fast, where the vendors prepared for replying would reply instantly, but there was usually a dramatic drop-off where if the vendor wasn't necessarily ready or was prepared, they usually never would reply. Even though Proposition 65 has been around since the 80s, some vendors were unaware of the regulation or did not think that the regulation would apply to them. In one case even, I called the company asking for a Proposition 65 statement, and the customer service replied to me, "I don't know what you're talking about, we sell marble." So clearly this company was unaware of, well, either didn't know what Proposition 65 was or just didn't think that it applied to them. However, if marble contained trace amounts of silica in their product and was able to break into respirable particle sizes and made it into the consumer market, the Proposition 65 labeling might be necessary. So education in these cases is important. So vendors can assist us with getting the information we need. Generally start by requesting composition information from the vendor. However, in a lot of these cases, vendors will refuse or put claim proprietary. In order to help us, we created a template explaining that we were looking to confirm if their products contain or do not contain a list of chemical-specific substances under the purview of California's Proposition 65, and then supplied them with a link to the regulations so they can review it themselves. The last part of the letter is that if their product does contain a Proposition 65 chemical, we ask that they at least name one chemical for each of the hazards, so per the regulation. And this brings us to the interpretation stage. So in a perfect situation, interpreting the data would just be screening the composition information from vendors provided and determine if any substances were listed on the Proposition 65 list. Now, what we found is some vendors were unable to provide the composition or evaluate their own products for Proposition 65. So gaps in knowledge had to be assessed, and we need to know how to proceed from the missing composition information or lack of data response. Additionally, we came across products where we had composition information, but evaluation was needed to determine if Proposition 65 labeling was appropriate. So in regards to the missing data, where possible, the client chose to switch from vendors to businesses which had Proposition 65 statements available. However, for some cases, it was not possible for the client to switch vendors, so alternative methods for making Proposition 65 determination had to be used. In these cases, we use sort of a hierarchy for a degree of certainty. Basically, if we have 100% composition, we have the greatest degree of certainty. Letters of certification would be after that. Partial composition with weight of evidence analysis. Email certifications, which is just an email from the vendor saying this does contain a Proposition 65 substance or it does not. And then our very lowest degree of certainty is knowledge from industry standards. Luckily, we only had to rely on this in one specific case. And in this case, a line of candles were assessed were varying in color. The vendor in this case had not previously evaluated their products for Proposition 65 chemicals and were currently in the process of making a determination. They had a large catalog of products and would not get done before the August 30th deadline. We discussed with the client different options and concluded that at a certain point we would perform a weight of evidence to determine if any commonly used chemicals in this industry could end up in their product. While lamps themselves, it was difficult to find any industry standards unless the chemical was kind of listed in the name, like silica, for example. We were able to perform a more thorough evaluation of the pigments used in their glass. So researching the glass pigments, we were able to find commonly used chemicals in the making of color glass. Using these industry standards, we were able to make an assessment based on the best available information, which products needed to be labeled for Proposition 65. In the example above, we recommended that the blue, white, and black would be labeled for cobalt, antimony, and chromium until vendor data became available. It's important to note that this was more of a temporary fix until vendors finished their own assessments for their products, in which case they would use the supplied Prop 65 labels. So in some cases, Proposition 65 chemicals were in low concentrations. In these cases, the client asked us to perform an exposure scenario in order to determine if the Proposition 65 labeling was necessary. The case we'll focus on was on a lamp line which contained Proposition 65 metals such as cobalt, lead, and nickel in its makeup. There we go. All right, so we decided to start by valuing the lead concentration, since it had the highest concentration of Prop 65 substances with one of the lowest safe harbor levels, reasoning that if the lead was below any safe harbor levels, there would be a good chance that the rest of the metals would be as well. A safe harbor level had already been established for this product by OEA for 15 micrograms per day for NSRL via the OR route and 0.5 micrograms per day for the MADL. OEA had also released in May of 2011 an interpretive guideline number 2011-001. This guideline explained an exposure scenario for calculating lead exposure for handling fishing tackle products, including during recreational use. The assessment included a guideline for hand-to-mouth transfer of lead through exposure to consumer products. In this label, lead intake for hand-to-mouth was evaluated as the sum of the direct intake and indirect intake, and that's the equation at the top. And each of these represented as the product of multiple variables, including the lead load, the surface area of the part of the hand in contact with the mouth, the transfer factor, hourly rate of contact, and the number of hours per day of contact. This matrix is taken from interpretive guidelines, shows the exposure pathway by the hand-to-mouth, lead exposure from consumer products by hand-to-mouth pathway that starts with the handling of the product, during which lead is rubbed off onto the hand through contact, transfer of lead-to-mouth handling in the consumer products, then touching the mouth with the hand or through the nail biting and other direct hand-to-mouth contact. It may also occur indirectly by handling the product and then handling other materials that ultimately contact or otherwise make their way into the mouth, such as eating food, drinking from a straw, or chewing on a pencil. Indirect transfer may involve one or more intermediate steps. So this is the equation, which I kind of just wrote to show how obnoxious an exposure scenario can be. It is important to note that this is a relatively simple exposure scenario. We were only evaluating one pathway, and it only was basically through ingestion. So the background math was also not shown in order to get to the lead load, for example. Using the larger size lamp, the product line to scale, the equation alpha, we selected the appropriate values for the coefficients. The important thing to note here is we weren't actually given any test data, so each value was considered for its maximum potential of lead output as well as greatest potential of conceivable exposure to the product. Both the NSRL and MADL safe harbor exceeded both the NSRL and MADL safe harbor limits, so we recommended that the label be for Prop 65 for both cancer and reproductive hazards based off the lead contact alone. So we were then able to stop the exposure assessment. The truth is, even though the difference was only 30 micrograms per day, this was at least 100 micrograms over the limit, too large, so that we would comfortably recommend you to have the label for cancer, and several factors too large for the NSRL or MADL, rather. This is partly due to the bounty hunter clause that if a group of lawyers knew that a raw material used containing Proposition 65 substance and the product was not labeled, and as evidence that the exemption a company provided in an exposure scenario, this scenario should be, without a doubt, the level of exposure was too small to ever exceed the safe harbor threshold. This is a common result. Basically, I'd recommend if the Proposition 65 substance is known to be present, it should be listed. So finally, we just had to implement the labels, and it was time to implement the labels for products containing Proposition 65 chemicals. We decided 65 labels. For the products containing Proposition 65, we decided whether on-product or full labels were appropriate for each printed media related to the product. Downstream users were also needed to be notified for changes to the Proposition 65 status, and for retail, Proposition 65 warning materials had to be provided for catalogs and website sales. During the stage, we found numerous interpretations of what clear and reasonable warnings consisted of for the regulation by different companies. This is an example of the letter of downstream users. The first paragraph cites the regulation requiring the notification under section 25600.2 of the Proposition 65. And if it's sold online or in catalogs, the warning must be provided. The second section is a list of the chemicals, or list of products containing the Proposition 65 chemicals and its corresponding label. And in the last paragraph, it asks that written or email acknowledgement of receipt. Our client chose to send each of these to the downstream users, variation of this letter, notifying them of the new Proposition 65 labels, requiring the labels internet page per California regulations. Then in the letter, they requested acknowledgement of receipt and to discuss discontinuing sales until a written confirmation was received. So under the new Proposition 65 amendment, catalogs and purchases like internet sales must contain the warning in the manner that is clearly associated with the specific product or hazard, like internet warnings. Our client already printed catalogs prior to August 30th deadline. So per regulations, since the Proposition 65 didn't take place retroactively, they were able to use the same labels. But for future sales, they recommended a label to be placed next to the label so it clearly associated with the hazards. For both internet and catalog sales, we found that there was many different interpretations of the clear and reasonable warning. The regulation only states that it has to be present on the page and clearly associated with the internet with the intended products. However, we found examples of this warning on product pages visible upon loading screen, while in other cases it was placed in the product description after you scroll down or in the banner of the website. What this amounted to is a risk management decision for our client. Basically, the farther you go from the word of the regulation, the easier an argument can be made that you are not labeling your product properly. Since there's yet to be a court case for this part of the regulation, it remains unclear what clear and reasonable means in this regard. A lawyer or special interest group would only have to argue that your label can be interpreted as unclear from the location of the text box in order to claim that you are not compliant. So until a key court case takes place, we are waiting to see how the regulation will be viewed going forward. So here's a couple examples that we found of Proposition 65 labels while we were scouring the internet. The first one, it was actually down to the left, was actually just in the banner of a coffee making group of some sort. Basically, it's right between the search bar and privacy policy. It just says Prop 65. It doesn't actually even say warning, and it's not in bold or capital letters. So this would be something that I wouldn't recommend for Proposition 65. The second one's a little bit closer on the top right. It just notes that California residents click here for the Proposition 65 warning. And at the very bottom is, again, an example I showed earlier of what I would suggest for clients to use for Proposition 65, right to the right of the product details with a clear warning in capital and bold print, as well as California Proposition 65 and a hyperlink that would bring you to the on-product page. So what we learned, Proposition 65 as a regulation is a pretty straightforward regulation. The process can be difficult if upstream entities are not prepared with the knowledge of their own products, be it composition information or labeling requirements, which then results in expert knowledge needed for proper assessment. The Proposition 65 amendment is more than just a new labeling requirement. It also a shift in responsibility and burden of supplying labels to suppliers and distributors, and as well as parts of the regulation centered around the clear and reasonable. Can be left to individual interpretation. So care must be made in order to reduce the risk to your own company. And that's it. Any questions? There. Cool.
Dan, can you say a word about commercial, industrial, and consumer, and how Prop 65 affects
that?
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question so they can hear on the webinar, please?
Yeah. Can you say the question again so I can repeat it on the microphone?
Sorry.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Ben. I wanted to ask if you could say a word about consumer versus commercial versus industrial as regards to regulation.
Yeah, so Proposition 65 is a consumer regulation. It really only applies to those products that end up on the consumer market. Basically, if you have an industrial product and there's a chance that a consumer going into the workplace, for example, or apartment, could be exposed to the Proposition 65 component, you would then have to label the product. However, if it's just used in an industrial setting, Proposition 65 doesn't apply to that. In that case, you default to OSHA.
I have a follow-up on that. I didn't know recently there's been an issue with third-party online vendors, like industrial products in consumer hands. Would that be considered potentially obscuring data provided by the vendor?
The responsibility would fall on the manufacturer to supply to the third-party vendor the Proposition 65 label. Basically, it's recommended that you just would provide a Proposition 65 labels if it contains a Proposition 65 chemical, if you know there's any chance it's sold on the internet. Because the minute it gets sold onto the internet, it's hard to argue that it's not going to be in the hands of a consumer at that point.
Question coming in from the webinar. If the substance has a tailored warning, does the product containing the substance need to list the tailored warning? What if the specific condition of exposure described in the tailored warning is not applicable? In that case, may a general warning be used?
Like a tailored warning, like they modified the Proposition 65 statement? Is that what they think they're talking about, Steve?
I'm guessing that's what they're talking about.
Yeah. If they go back to I hope this answers the question. If they go back to the safe harbor language for the Proposition 65 substance, if you can argue that there would be no exposure to the Proposition 65 substance, they wouldn't have to label their product, since the OEHA is really focusing on exposure for Proposition 65. As of the new amendment, they would be okay on that point. However, if there is a chance of exposure, then they could probably label it for the Prop 65 at that point.
All right, we're going to get started with our first emerging issue. So in between our key presentations, we're going to be having 5-minute talks on just hot button issues that are coming. So next up, we have Nichelle Rubash. Nichelle is a regulatory project coordinator here at PACE and works primarily with our regulatory consulting team. She's been with us for 4 years and holds a Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Science. So please welcome Nichelle.
In my EU Poison Center talk, I'll be talking about background information on EU poison centers, current member state requirements, as well as the variety of them and why we are changing to a new unified system through Annex 8, the requirements of Annex 8, the timeline, and how to be prepared. So a little background in Article 45 of Regulation 1272/2008, which is CLP. It requires each country to have an appointed body. These appointed bodies have become commonly referred to as poison centers. These poison centers receive and store information on hazardous ingredients contained within the mixtures, and they are used in case of emergency due to health or physical hazards, as well as they're available 24/7 to those who need them. The product information about the hazards and the mixtures is provided to the poison centers by importers and downstream users who are placing them on the market. These poison centers receive over 600,000 calls a year. That's roughly 1,700 calls a day. A majority of them are by consumers, and through the consumers, roughly 50% is accidental children exposure. Also used by physicians and less likely industrial users. The poison center contact information is required and located in section 1.4 of the European SDS. And for which products it applies to are mixtures with health or physical hazard classification, biocides, detergents, and cleaning agents. Mixtures that are exempt are those solely for research and development, and any products or chemicals exempt from CLP, also explosives and non-hazardous gases. So currently, each EU member state has interpreted this appointed bodies legislation very differently with variety of requirements, sometimes hard to dig out, and the information for each one, like I said, varies across the countries. Right here, I just gave an example of 4 countries. With the UK, it is just a simple SDS. It is voluntary, and you send it through an email. However, in France, you'll need full composition, the SDS label, the type of packaging, the quantity on the market, and it is very mandatory, and it's a web portal submission. And so these are just 4 of the countries of all those who are in the European Union. And with the variety, like I mentioned, it is hard to figure out what you're required for each country, and so now they have done a review of Article 45 and found that harmonizing the poison centers is possible and also very desired. This regulation is through Annex 8, harmonizing the information relating to emergency health response. And the action they're taking is a common electronic format will be established for you to enter your information. Everyone will be entering uniform information, and then all emergency responders in the EU will be provided with the same medical information and have it available for use when they are contacted. And in some cases, this will help improve services of the poison centers. So before you can use an EU poison center under Annex 8, the information that will be required by the submitters is the health and the physical hazard information, as well as composition of the mixture, product category, size and type of packaging, as well as who the products are being used by. So as consumers, professionals, industrial users, or a combination of the 3. For consumers and professional goods, you must provide full composition. However, industrial users, you can use lesser submission so that you don't have to provide quite as much information. But that is only if you can confirm that it will be for industrial use only. And the submitter will be required to create a unique formula identifier, which is commonly being referred to as a UFI by electronic means. This UFI will be specific towards your product based on your mixture, and it will link your product to on the market back to the poison center. So whoever contacts it, they can refer to this UFI number, which is comprised of letters and numbers. It must be printed on the label of the hazardous mixture. So right here I have an example of a label, CLP label with the pictogram, and then the UFI number clearly printed on there in a 16 character in 4 blocks. And if you were to make any sort of change to your product, a formulation change, new information has come about hazards or the toxicology of it, you will need to resubmit the information and create a new UFI number. And this gets almost a little messy when you're talking about mixtures who are used by your company, then in a product for another company. So that's called mixture in a mixture, where if company A creates a UFI number for their product and then they have some sort of formulation change or update that causes them to generate a new UFI number, and their product is used as composition in company B's product, company B must then submit a new notification and generate a new UFI number. Company B's product is used as composition in company C and D's mixtures. Both company C and D will have to generate a new UFI number and do a new notification. It's not messy, but it's a system that will be easily tracked currently. So in preparing for Annex 8, presently you just notify according to each member state. By 2020, January 1st, consumer mixtures must comply with Annex 8 with the UFI numbers. 2021, professional mixtures, industrial mixtures by 2024, and then all submissions before that will expire and everyone should comply by 2025. So in order to be prepared for this, know where your supply chain is, know where your product is going on the market. Is it industrial? Is it consumer? Are you the duty holder? And are your products used in other companies' formulations? In that case, if you have an industrial product that goes to a company and you consider yourself it's an industrial mixture, but however a downstream user ends up using in a consumer product, you will be contacted. You will have to help that company comply by the 2020 consumer mixture. And then internally, you can designate codes to your products. Many companies already do this already for easy referral to their products, but you can use your internal code to relate to your UFI number, and then make sure that you have your UFI numbers on your labels on the appropriate timing. And then make sure you prepare your notification files by 2019 or 2020 and monitor the Poison Center notification format, and make sure that your products are notified on time. All right, any questions?
Okay. Up next, we have Peter Rose. Peter is a senior regulatory specialist here at PACE. He's been with us for 10 years and is a subject matter expert in EU REACH, as well as authors hazard assessments for chemical components. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry and a PhD in Environmental Toxicology from the University of Wisconsin. So welcome, Peter.
Good evening, everybody. To tell you a little bit about us, not just me personally, the consulting group I work with has been a fairly recent entity at PACE, but elements of it have been around for years. We have, among other activities, been supporting REACH work for clients ranging from small formulators all the way up to large chemical companies with a footprint in the EU itself. We've been doing this for over 12 years. Now, I don't want to bore you too much with the history of REACH, so I have just this one slide that shows why 2018 is a particularly good time to look back and reflect. Now, REACH was a long time in negotiating, and the basic good idea behind it was they wanted to replace one or patchwork of chemical safety laws in the European Union with one single law that would cover the entire community. Some of the key ideas in it are, firstly, that with very few exceptions, no substances were going to be allowed on the market without at least some data being provided. So nothing was going to be grandfathered in anymore. Secondly, companies are going to have to work together to provide this data, because that would allow, saving testing costs and also reduce the amount of animal testing that's going to be required. And lastly, REACH can only really apply to entities that are in the European Union itself, a legal entity. If you're outside the European Union, there is actually nothing that the European Union can do to you. On the other hand, there's nothing you can do for them either. You have no standing to act under REACH. You have to go through some agent within the European Union, such as an only representative. Now, the first thing that happened when REACH went into effect was that the chemical agency put together a list of all existing substances and prioritized it according to hazard and volume. These all registrants of, or all pre-registrants of these substances that were doing the same substance were organized into data sharing groups. The first registration deadline was actually in 2010, which covered the very high volume chemicals like greater than 1,000 tons per year, millions of tons per year in the case of some commodity solvents, and also the things that were extremely hazardous. The second deadline was in 2013, which covered the high volume chemicals that weren't in the first registration band. And the last registration deadline was actually May of this past year, which covered ostensibly everything else. Well, it didn't really cover everything because, as you can see, there were 140,000 pre-registrations as of 2008. And as of May of this year, only 88,000 dossiers have been submitted. I won't make you do the math. That's about 60%. So something like 40% of all the pre-registrations just apparently never actually came to fruition. So we'll talk a little bit about orphan substances a little bit later. Okay. And just so we're on the same page, I'll give you just a few brief terms and try to go through this slide as fast as I can. So ECHA is the European Chemicals Agency. It's Europe's answer to the EPA. A registrant is someone who either manufactures a substance or imports it to the European Union. The registrants are responsible for providing ECHA with information about a chemical and its uses. And if there's more than one manufacturer doing the same substance, they're supposed to work together. They have to work together as co-registrants. The SIF, or Substance Information Exchange Forum, is the group by which co-registrants actually share data. If there is a SIF, typically there'll be one lead registrant who's responsible for getting all the data together. And then the other member registrants of the SIF are responsible for paying the lead registrant for the use of the data, a fair price. as well as providing their own information on specific uses and annual volumes. The only representative is just that. That is an intermediary that acts within the European Union on behalf of a registrant. They take over all the legal responsibilities and submitting the paperwork. Now, if you're outside the EU, that's one way that you can act in the European Union. Also, that provides confidentiality for registrants that are in the EU already. Let's see, downstream users or DUs are people that buy from the registrants. So someone like a formulator would be a downstream user. They're not really responsible for registration, but they are responsible for communicating the registrant's hazard data downstream to their customers, and also providing their uses and their customers' uses back up to the registrant so they know what is actually being done with their substances. Identified uses are basically just that. They are things that the registrant knows their product is being used for. In a dossier, the registrant is required to provide specific information on their identified uses in terms of what sector of the market they're in. That's industrial, professional, or consumer. Process categories such as rolling or application by roller or application by brush or spray. Environmental release factors, product categories, etc. As I said, the industrial, professional, and consumers are sectors of use, and consumers are sectors of use. There are also the people that are in those sectors. So an industrial user is expected to work in a factory in a single location. Professional user may have the same level of training as an industrial user, but they can be in a variety of locations or working at a small facility like just a mom and pop shop. Consumer users, on the other hand, are just your average Joe in the field, and you can barely rely on them to read the label, basically. And lastly, classifications are known hazards that we have a specific criterion for. So something is a carcinogen or something is acutely toxic in the environment. Okay, so on to our case studies. Our first one is, get the title of, what was that use again? So the important thing to note here is that under REACH, chemicals are regulated kind of similarly to drugs or pesticides. You can only sell it for a use that has been registered. Most uses are actually really rather broad, like ethanol, just as an example, is registered specifically as industrial use as fuel or use as a solvent in industrial settings. So any application that can't be considered under a really broad heading like that was more or less off-label, so you can't sell it for that purpose. Now, in this example, our customer had a component that was used in specialty coating materials, and our customers' downstream users were telling them things that led them to believe that their product was only used in industrial settings. Well, they showed the information to us, we reviewed it, and we thought, well, it looks a lot like you've got a professional user, and you're not just using this stuff in factories, or they're not just using it in factories. They're also potentially using it out in the field, out of doors. So our customer is actually very much on top of things. They knew exactly who their customers were and who the contact people were at those places. So we got information back pretty quickly about this, and it turned out that this material was actually being used in professional goods for field applications. So that was easy enough to deal with. We added the correct identified uses and exposure scenarios to the dossier, and everything went forward. There was no problem. The field use was not actually a particularly large portion of this product's sales, but what this allowed was that articles coated with these products could be shipped out in the field, and if they needed to be repaired, they could be repaired out in the field. You know, they didn't have to be sent back to the factory in order to be recoded. Case study number 2, well, all the components are registered. And this was a few years ago during the phase-in period, okay? At that time, not all the substances had to be registered, but they all had to be at least pre-registered, so ECHA was aware that they were going to be in the market. In the REACH world, there are formulators that I've mentioned, and there are manufacturers, and the easiest way to be compliant with REACH as a formulator is to make sure that your supply chain has all registered components in it. And that was in fact the case here. Our customer had been using all pre-registered components. Everything was properly done. except when we looked at their formulation, it turned out that they were probably reacting with each other to form a new substance. That's not formulation anymore, that's manufacture. And at that point, the new substance they were making was not pre-registered, so it would have been subject to immediate registration under some circumstances. Well, in this case, the minimum volume for registration is 1 ton per year. If you bring in less than 1 ton per year, then you're subject to notification rather than registration. It's just the bureaucratic information about who's bringing it in, where, how much, who do you contact if there's a problem. So our customer had an OR to handle their legal responsibilities, and that meant that they could bring in 1 ton per year of this product plus the actual product or formulation volume up to 1 ton per year through this only representative. And the customer looked at that and looked at their financials and said, well, we can live with that. We'll keep our volume of this product under 1 ton per year. We'll develop our market share. We'll explore the European Union market. And if it turns out that we can make more money by bringing in a larger volume, then we'll register, but not until then. The other possibility that they could have done would have been to let all of their importers handle the notifications for them, which would have allowed them to bring in as many 1 ton per year units as they had importers. The problem with that was that if they'd gone this way, they would have had to disclose their complete composition to every one of those importers so they could notify properly. Most companies aren't willing to do that, and our customer is no exception to that. So they stuck with 1 ton per year, and they're happy with it for right now. Study 3, can you help us with the CEF maybe? Well, this was a pretty simple case. Customer came to us specifically asking us to help them out with getting into a member or becoming a member registrant for the solvent that they were using in one of their products. The reason they felt that they needed to register was that their use wasn't covered by the CEF during the main registration. Well, when we looked at it, it turned out that they were using a solvent that had only been registered for industrial and professional users. They had a consumer use for this, okay? When we looked further into the dossier, it turned out that the registration wasn't just, we aren't putting in consumer uses, but we have no consumer uses. This stuff is not used explicitly for consumer uses in the European Union. They'd said it repeatedly throughout the dossier. So they weren't just needing to register, they were needing to register something that was contradictory to the existing dossier or the existing registration. So they would have needed to negotiate for the right to use the data and create a conflict at the same time. So given the cost of just getting the data sharing agreement in the first place, the cost of doing the registration, the cost of getting legal advice within the European Union to handle this potential conflict, and the problems that were going to be caused by creating conflict, and taking that against their potential sales volume, they decided it just wasn't worth it. So they chose not to market the product in the European Union. Now, on their side, the actual packaging size was pretty small and the composition was pretty low, but this was actually a consumer use. It was a conflict. This was a limitation on us as well because we have and can and have assisted customers with contacting CEFs and arranging letters of access. This was more than we thought we could handle because of legalities involved. Study 4, orphan substances. This again happened during the phase-in period. Chemicals had to be at the least on the ECHA's pre-registration list, but there was a grace period before the registrations had to be complete. So this customer actually had 2 things that they were worried about. Chemical 1 was an orphan in the sense that their suppliers were not registering this particular chemical. There was an active registration going on, but they were sourcing their raw materials in the United States, and none of the US suppliers were willing to register. Chemical 2 had a single pre-registrant for whom or from whom they were buying this material, but the pre-registrant said explicitly to our customer, we are not going to follow through on the registration. We're just going to run out the clock, and as of May 2018, this won't be on the market anymore. So In principle, our customer could have rearranged their entire supply chain in support of the first chemical. They could have gone to the European Union or European Union vendors, sourced their chemical or their materials there, and had a completely compliant formulation. But it turned out that was a relatively economical commodity chemical that had a lot of registrants. It was cheaper for them to register the substance themselves, join the CEF, get a letter of access. There were so many registrants of it that the data sharing costs were actually really low by comparison. It was cheaper for them to have that one single upfront cost than to have the ongoing cost of buying registered substances. In the second case, though, there was no data. It was actually going to be orphaned. The suppliers didn't have any test data on it for the registration, and it was beyond the customer's scope to get a registration dossier together on it. So they could have bought all that expertise, but it wasn't worth the cost of, or as compared to the profitability of the product. So they ended up just reformulating. And our last case study is titled, Whose SDS is this anyway? You'll remember that under REACH, companies that are not organized in the European Union don't have any legal responsibilities. So in this case, our customer had very complicated formulations, and quite a few of them. They thought that the European Union customers, that their customers in the European Union should be responsible for the European Union's SDS. Their distributors in the European Union didn't agree with this point, at least in part because they wanted to make sure that our customer's name, the maker of the product, that their name was on the SDS and the label, because the distributor's name doesn't sell the product, the manufacturer's name does. They've got the reputation, right? There's a lot of information that goes on an SDS. So as Michelle had mentioned earlier, there is the emergency contact information. SDSs have to be in the specific languages of the European Union. So there were good reasons why the customer did not want to have the responsibility of doing the SDSs themselves. On the other hand, the customers, or pardon me, the distributors didn't know anything at all about the formulation, so they weren't in a position to create the SDSs. They had our customer has an only representative, of course, because they need to have someone to act on their behalf. The only representative was unwilling to handle SDS authoring as well because of the complication or the complexity of all of the formulations. So the solution we came up with was to provide mostly complete SDSs through PACE. I mean, we have a long experience of authoring SDSs in all the languages of the European, or official languages of the European Union. That's not a problem for us. So we don't have the country-specific information as far as emergency contact information, but that can be provided later. So we provided a mostly filled out SDSs and labels as templates, and the downstream users or the importers were then able to complete everything themselves. We got legal advice from our contacts within the European Union to make sure this was all going to be okay as far as the legalities of the matter. So a lot of the basic conclusion in these examples is simply to be proactive about getting information together. Most of these cases revolved around some gap in the information that could have been caught earlier than it was, whether that was supply chain communication or a question of the legal requirements or basic knowledge of the product. But the other thing that shakes out of this is to be organized about things. Our last two examples had less to do with one key piece of information that was missing and more to do with just looking at all the factors comprehensively so that, including sales data and cost estimates, you can make the right decision for your products. Of course, it never hurts to get your ducks in a row earlier than all that, but organization is key. And part and parcel of that is that this is not just important for the European Union. The rest of the world has looked at REACH as an example of how to do chemical legislation or chemical safety legislation. So you have REACH-like legislation coming online throughout the rest of the world. For example, in Korea, you have AREX, which is also known as K-REACH, which, similar to REACH, is applicable to people that are in Korea only. So there are no direct effects on exporters, but there are certainly indirect effects regarding safety data sheets and labels. If you're more interested in K-REACH, our coworker Kayla Ritchie has an extensive poster on the subject. It's over in the break room with all the treats and such. Similar to K-REACH, there's China REACH, which is applicable only to new substances. That leaves also in effect on people that are, or agents that are in China only. Malaysia has a similar law that relates only to environmental safety. And unlike these other regimes, there is no legal requirement that the actor be within Malaysia. So, sorry, yes, to conclude, well, REACH itself is not over yet. We're mostly done with the pre-registered substances, although not entirely. But all new substances are still going to need registration. And similarly, all new products are going to have to be compliant with their labeling and SDSs. Also, existing registrations and products are going to need to be up to date. And one of the things that ECHA is promising is this REACH Enforce action for 2019. That is going to be looking specifically at making sure that all registrations are current and up to date, and that all labels and SDSs are also current and up to date. Now, this is going to include sending inspectors to customs agents at ports of entry. They promise to have 1,000 trained agents or trained inspectors sent out to the field for this year. So again, know your substances and know your products, know your customers and know your suppliers, and know what you're capable of doing, what you need help with. So thanks, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Peter, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about, you said, a manufacturer has other manufacturers that produce the same products that are expected to work together? To me, that sounds like collusion, but it sounds like in Europe, it's expected that manufacturers of similar products are expected to work together. That doesn't really...
Well, that's product. Sorry, that's products just in the sense of the substances themselves. I mean, under REACH, a substance is registered. So if you're doing polyethylene glycol and you're a manufacturer of polyethylene glycol, you have to register that. If you're making cleaning products, for example, that depend on polyethylene glycol as an active ingredient, you don't have to work with other formulators. But if you're a producer, you do have to work together. So, and work together, that means specifically define what the uses are, define what the hazards are, define what the classification is, and provide information about hazards, human toxicity, like respiratory tox, oral toxicity, toxicity to aquatic environments, flammability, information like that. But obviously, if you're a member of one of these CIFs, then there's a lot of subtle communication going on because no one wants to reveal their manufacturing techniques.
All right, I think we're ready for our next mini talk from Nichelle. We previously heard from her about emerging issue in poison centers, and now she'll be sharing with us on the emerging issue of Brexit. Welcome back, Nichelle.
Thank you. As hopefully everybody is aware, Brexit is the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union, and that was voted on the 23rd of June in 2016. And just this last weekend, the draft deal proposed by Theresa May was approved by the EU summit. And then later on this month, the UK Parliament will be voting on it. There's much indecisiveness about this, as it leaves the UK neither still in the EU, but not also out of the EU. And then with the many resignations going on, it is still up in the air as to what will be decided, how it will be voted. And then after that, it's March 29th at specifically 11 p.m. UK time. They are leaving the EU. And if all 27 member states vote on it, they will have a transition period for 21 months until January 1st, 2021. So with the possible Brexit scenarios and everything still being up in there are 3 different options for how things may go. The UK, option 1 is that the UK will leave the EU system with no deal March 30th with the potential transition period through the end of 2020. Option 2 is that the UK will leave with some sort of deal with the EU 27, which are the remaining 27 EU countries,
And the deal will cover goods, but not services. And it may include some sort of associate membership with ECA, but it also might not. And then the third deal is that the UK exits Brexit and remains part of the EU, and we keep moving as we presently are. So with tonight, I'll be focusing on the no deal, option 1. And with that, the UK is currently making preparations for an option that we don't use the chemical legislation shared with the EU. The UK Health and Safety Executive, HSC, will take on most of the responsibilities, including CLP, which is the alignment with GHS, and then the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, will be assisting HSC, and they'll be taking on the REACH side portion of it. And a good reference for many of your questions relating to REACH, CLP, and this would be the ECHO webpage. And for those of you who are getting this presentation tomorrow, just copy, link it over, and read through whatever questions you may have. So as they're deciding what to do, the UK government has stated that the existing EU legislation should continue to apply once the UK has left the EU. Current option they're talking about is called a lift and shift, where they will lift the current EU legislation and just shift it into their own. But they're also mentioning that with the UK breaking from the EU, they want some sort of flexibility that would come with the deal, and so something that would help benefit them. So as far as like what it may develop into, that is also still up in the air. REACH has been the hardest challenge so far. Registration will be required in both the EU and EU and UK systems. Any existing registration will be grandfathered into the UK law, and registration still in the pipeline come March will not be. And then the expected UK registration after the divorce will be very similar to what it is now currently with ECHA, with similar fees. And HSC is very confident on operating without the assistance of ECHA. They have a current IT system in place that is mostly built that will enable the registration and regulation of chemicals placed on the market after Brexit. It is very similar to how people register for car tabs right now in the UK. And so it doesn't operate quite to the efficiency level of the REACH IT system, but it is operable. Back in August, they said, it will work tomorrow if need be. So a few months later, they have they're doing mass testing right now to make sure it can handle the bulk of users that they are expected to have. And they're hoping to release it later on to do some test trial runs with actual users. So also with REACH comes all the registrations, and currently the UK has about 12,000 registrations. That is second only to Germany, which has the most, and they have 5,600 substances registered. And so if the UK leaves the EU, then all UK registrations will be considered non-existent. If you're a manufacturer, you will need to transfer your UK OR to a EU7 based OR, and then vice versa, that if you have an OR in the EU27, you will need to also get a OR based in the UK, depending upon which market you're going to, if you're going to continue to operate in Europe or in the UK. And ECHA is currently recommending that you do some sort of contractual agreement that it will take place the moment that they leave the UK, so that they leave Europe. So you cannot transfer or have two ORs beforehand, only representatives beforehand, as the UK is not yet considered to be a third country. So most people are setting up that the moment that they leave the Europe, it will take place, this contractual agreement will take place with another OR. And so a couple other questions is, does your company manufacture a substance placed on the European market from a UK-based importer, or do you have a downstream user in the EU27 that relies on REACH authorization granted by the UK supplier? And with that, for the authorization that will become no longer valid, you will need to find new authorization. You can appoint only representative located within the EU to carry out the required registration, or you can register it yourself if you are a manufacturer, or since you are the manufacturer, fine, register it yourself. Or you can have the importer register it through a legal entity, or as the manufacturer, you can register it yourself through an OR. And then as for the downstream user, more than likely you will be contacted by somebody. If you have a strong presence in Europe, you would be contacted by the downstream user wondering what your action is going to be, if you're going to continue to place it on the European market or not. Another strong point of contention with Brexit is the Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland border. They strongly do not want to place an actual physical border there. They do not want to reopen old wounds or have the sort of discord that was going there. They don't want custom posts all along the border. And so they're trying to work on some sort of special deal for Northern Ireland. And EU's proposition right now is a common regulatory area. However, the EU's concern, though, is that goods through this special deal will somehow make their way onto the EU market and not comply with all of the EU regulations. So as far as safety data sheets go, labels and safety data sheets will need to be updated to the name and addresses of the EU company who is placing the product on the market. The UK expects the safety data sheets to still look the same as before Brexit. The most important thing is communicating to the users safety. As for a timeline for updating it, they're being pretty reasonable about it. It's as you should be analyzing your materials every couple of years anyway. So as you get new information on hazards, or if some toxicology information comes along and you're updating that in your SDS, go ahead and update the name and address without proper. So you need to update the name and address as well as whatever the UK uses as their new legislation. Without updating those, it technically will not meet legislation requirements. And as far as the UK poison centers, registration is voluntary and only an SDS is required. However, they are currently following the Annex 8 legislation I talked about earlier today. But if they split from the EU, they no longer can utilize ECHA to that degree, so they will be probably continuing with their current method of UK Poison Center, but they might also end up following along the lines of the Annex 8 just to require more information and for it to be more uniform. So amongst the laundry list of questions that still remain to be answered are, will there be transitional arrangements for switching only representatives? What fees will there be to pay? Who's going to pay them? Is the importer going to register it, or is the manufacturer who is all going to pay those fees? Will the UK remain close to reach CLP and regulations, or will they choose to divert? And will Brexit still occur? So I'm being prepared for Brexit to make sure to monitor Brexit negotiations. This is kind of difficult, as even though we are continuing to be updated on what's going on, there's still no direction of action to take yet. And then know your supply chain, even if that means looking up on Google downstream where your product ends up, how it affects you or how it may affect your sales. And communicate with your suppliers and vendors. Make sure to prepare legal entity options, and then amongst all this, assign a budget for the work that will need to be done. Are there any questions?
Okay, next up, you are in for a treat, Angela. It's getting later, getting goofy. Angela Wutz has 15 years of experience in the chemical regulatory field. In her current role as our General Manager for Regulatory Services at Pace Analytical, she oversees 100+ regulatory professionals, assisting our clients with their global regulatory needs in the areas of supply chain, hazard communication, product stewardship. Angela holds a Bachelor of Science in Medical Microbiology and Immunology from the University of Wisconsin. Please welcome Angela.
Hi, everybody. Well, thanks for sticking in there with me. I know you're probably all just like, get to Steve. But you get 20 minutes of supply chain data with me first. See if I can get the clicker to work. There we go. Okay. And basically, during this presentation, I am going to walk you through the basic points of developing and implementing a regulatory data supply chain management program. I'm going to briefly cover why it's important, why would you do this in the first place, what you should collect, both how you should determine what you need and what I kind of think maybe you should think about, how to collect it, where to put it once you collect that information, and when you should do it. And I'm also going to talk more specifically about a case study for a client that we implemented an RDM program for, and some lessons learned from that implementation. So I'm guessing some of you in the room might feel like this about regulatory data requests. You're constantly being asked for information from your customers, and you're constantly having to ask your suppliers for information. The same customers make multiple requests, each time asking for a different piece of information, and sometimes they send you these packets of information. Now, granted, they're electronic now, they're not paper, but if you printed them, they'd be like this thick. So why are we constantly asking and seeking this data? Regulatory compliance has become increasingly complex, and I think you've had some talks leading up to mine that really illustrates that. You know, the Brexit issue really is illustrating how complex complying with regulations is. So there are multiple factors that drive the need to collect this information. And one of the big ones is, and the one probably you think of right away, is that it's required by law. You have to have a certain level of information in order to comply with regulations. On the international level, REACH and all those REACH-like laws that Peter mentioned, they require you to communicate up and down the supply chain. You literally are, it's laid out in the law. It tells you in the regulation, you will do this. Here in the US, the recent changes to the HAZCOM standard required you to have a better idea of what was in your raw materials or to work with your suppliers to get classification data. I'm guessing most of you got requests from your customers asking for GHS classifications of your products. And I'm guessing that most of you had to talk to your suppliers in order to figure out what was in your raw materials in order to come up with a classification. It's not possible to comply with things like conflict mineral reporting if you don't have a certificate of origin. And then locally, there are all kinds of states that have taken specific actions to those states. We've heard about Prop 65. California is very prodigious in the regulatory arena. So there's Prop 65. They have their South Coast Air District, which changed recently. They also have the Safer Consumer Product Acts, which causes a lot of data to be collected. And coming up after me is Steve, and he's going to talk about TSCA. I know you're all really excited. Guess what you have to have? Data. So the second type of drivers really driving the need for this data are what I call market drivers. And what I mean by this are they're standards, but they're not required by law, but they are necessary in order for you to do business in certain markets. And so one of those would be like a competitive edge claim, something that you want to claim that makes your product superior to other products. And I included this Green Seal certified label up here. You know, green labeling is one of those. Maybe you want to claim it's natural or biodegradable. All of those claims require data to substantiate them. There are also customer demanded market drivers, so both industry and consumer. Target and Walmart, for example, both have sustainability programs. If you want to put product on Walmart's shelves, you will go into their system, which happens to be called the Works. You will input the data that they require, or you don't get shelf space. It's as simple as that. And I know I say it's simple, but it's not really that simple. The general consumer also drives market conditions. So I included this non-GMO Project Verified up here. You might have seen this on Food You Buy. There's these chips I buy at Costco that have this. They're really good. But, you know, this is driven by consumers. BPA is a great example. Removing BPA from plastics was driven by consumers. And consumer drivers are tricky because they're unpredictable. And they don't always target the thing that we as scientists and risk managers would consider high risk. So a lot of times we're caught off guard by what consumers think is a concern in our products. There are also industry-specific requirements. I put the GADSA list on here. If you're in the automotive market, I'm sure you're familiar with that. If you sell products in the cosmetic market, there are specific requirements for the cosmetic market. Excuse me, I've been fighting this cold all week. So thirdly, I want to mention internal drivers. And I think it's important to recognize that there are drivers from inside your company that can be every bit as powerful as those external market and regulatory law drivers. And I think one of the most important roles that we play as product stewards from a business standpoint is that of risk manager. So having a robust regulatory data management program really has a risk mitigating effect for your company. So you can confidently state that you're in compliance with regulations. You have the ability to monitor for emerging regulations. If the next BPA is being discussed on the evening news, you can proactively review your products to determine your potential exposure and risk. Having these relationships with your suppliers and having transparency in your supply chain also helps with business continuity and cost issues. So you're able to more easily identify issues that may arise and could interfere with the supply of your raw materials. Okay, so I talked about why I think this is so important. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and tell you a little bit more about the specific process. And I'm going to start with what you should collect. And the reason I'm starting with this is that it is the most important part in creating your program. So oftentimes you can get caught up in an immediate need. You have a pressing regulatory compliance issue or a customer is demanding something. And so you go out and you collect a specific piece of information from your suppliers. And then that cycle repeats itself over and over and over. And so I really would encourage you to sit down and think about the attributes that you would like to know about the products that you buy and develop a list. And then you can use that list so that you're not constantly barraging your suppliers with requests for a single piece of information. You want to think about, what do your customers want to know? When you get those packets that, they used to be this thick, but now they're electronic. It just doesn't have the same impact. But what are they asking you for? When you get requests from your customers, what are those requests? Do they want certifications? Is there industry-specific information that you're going to have to provide? Do you need to input certain information into the works to get on Walmart shelves? Do you have to disclose certain information? What do you need to know to meet those regulatory drivers that I mentioned? What about your internal customers? What does product development need to know? What does sales and marketing need to know? The attribute database allows you to determine specifically what you should ask for all vendors from all materials you buy. Okay, so now I'm going to give you my opinion. So what I think you should go and get is 100% composition on everything you buy from every vendor. Yeah, there it was. Okay, that's a gold standard, but I know, and you all know, that that's probably not practical. But if you know 100% of what's coming in the door, it's really easy to comply with downstream regulations. However, you're not going to get it all from every supplier. Just aren't. That's how business works. So the next level down is to consider those composition disclosures and those compliance certifications. But if you haven't built your attribute database, you don't know which ones to ask for. So that's why you want to start with that. And the other thing is, if you have that database set, you can collect certain certificates that can serve multi-purpose. So certificate of origin is really an important one. It can help you with conflict minerals. It can also help you with trade compliance. I would also consider an SDS to be an essential part of your data package. Not only are they required to bring a chemical in-house, but they often contain essential regulatory information. In the United States, they should all contain GHS classifications. We do run into ones all the time that don't, but they should. And they also have additional regulatory information in section 15, and those can be really helpful. You can data mine that section for additional information. Okay, so you've decided what you're going to collect, and the next question I always get from our clients is, how the heck are we going to do this? They tell me, Angela, I have so many suppliers and we buy so many materials. They're not going to work with us on this, and it's insurmountable. We can't do it. So my best advice to you on this is to build relationships with your suppliers. So first of all, you need to identify the right person to talk to. If you can find the person who has a similar role to you at your supplier, that's a great place to start. Not every supplier has a regulatory person, but a lot of them do. That's the person you want to talk to. Also, it takes actual communication. This, you will need to pick up the phone, dial it, and actually talk to a person on the other end. Unfortunately, sending out an electronic form to a general email box generally won't get you the results that you're looking for. And since you've already built that attribute database and you know what you're collecting and why, you can share that information with your suppliers. Oftentimes, explaining your intentions can smooth the way to disclosure. So secondly, use your sourcing agents as leverage when you can. Your purchasing agents may have great relationships with someone at your supplier, and oftentimes they are working with a salesperson on the other end. My salespeople always laugh when I say this, but they're really motivated to sell. So if the deal's not going to close without the information, the salespeople often will get you what you need. And you may want to consider working your regulatory disclosure into your purchasing agreements. So if your suppliers know upfront that it's going to be required that they disclose information, that also can help smooth the way. And then thirdly, work with the right suppliers. And what I mean by this is you are going to come across those suppliers that they don't want to work with you on this. They're not going to give you the information you need. They either don't respond, or they don't know, or they just don't care. And so at that point, you're going to need to make a business decision that considers the potential risk of continuing to do business with this supplier and the possible risk to compliance or downstream activities. And then finally, you need a process. So you should do it the same way every single time, every new chemical that comes in-house, every new supplier that comes on board. Okay, got all this information. Again, it's not exactly like this because there's no paper anymore, but so many emails in your email box. What are you going to do with all this information? So you want to make sure you store it somewhere that's all together. And it seems really basic, but you'd be surprised how many clients we go into and they say, well, I've got information on my hard drive, and we have this shared drive, and I have a filing cabinet, and oh, we have this online database thing where we have, and it's everywhere, and nobody can find anything. So put it all in one place. Preferably accessible, so not somebody's hard drive that they leave at home or falls out of their car and their teenager runs over it with their car, and you lose everything. So centrally available, accessible. If you have a system that has your other product stewardship activities like SDSs, volume tracking, etc., those are great options. If you do put data in those systems, though, I would encourage you to come up with a way to reference that data, because at some point you're going to look at that information and say, huh, where did that come from? And so you want to be able to trace it back to a document or data that you got from your supplier that hopefully you have electronically archived somewhere. Okay, so moving on to our case study, I want to tell you a little bit about the client themselves before I tell you about what we did for them. They are a Fortune 500 company. They're a pretty big company. They have around 40,000 employees globally. They're a large conglomerate, so they're in a whole bunch of different things. They had global sales, global sourcing, and global manufacturing. So complicated. And they had some obstacles with developing this process. They didn't know what they needed. So they knew they needed something, but they didn't know what it was. They didn't have anywhere to put the information. They didn't have a process to go out and get the information. And, but they did know that they wanted to at least minimize any impact that would happen to their suppliers. So they wanted a very low impact process. And they also knew that while they didn't currently have a system, they were getting a massive enterprise management system within the next 5 years. So whatever we came up with had to be able to go into that system that wasn't totally defined within the next 5 years. So we said, no problem, we can help you. So again, the first thing we did was develop that attribute list. We worked with several of their SMEs to come up with a list of what was needed for the various markets and regulatory requirements. We worked with them to define the environmental and human health data points that were needed, which regulatory certifications were needed, and a list of additional documents that would be collected, besides the SDSs, which we also collected. And we also worked with them to better define which markets their products were going into. After we had the attribute list defined, we worked with them to develop a storage solution that would meet their needs. And I should say, we are not software people, so we did not build the software. We just advised on maybe what was a good choice. And in this case, we decided to go with a custom access database. Pretty simple. We used it because it solved several of the obstacles that the client was facing. While they didn't currently have any storage, they knew that that enterprise management system was coming. And they knew they were going to have to integrate with that within the next 5 years. The access database was very simple. It allowed for really easy data entry. It was actually built in the same order that the collection was done, and so that the data entry people could key it directly off the forms pretty simply. And it was designed specifically to house their data points. All right. So all the solutions we design and develop for our customers are unique. And in this case, I mentioned earlier, they really wanted to minimize impact on their suppliers. So for that reason, we did data mining first. So we data mined those existing databases that they had, those existing documents. We also searched publicly available documents. And so we did all of that, and once those sources were exhausted, we then moved forward with contacting vendors to fill in any data gaps that existed. The custom design process also included an escalation procedure, which did include the client's sourcing context. And to give you some idea of scale of this project, it was staffed by about 2.5 FTEs for approximately 18 months. And they collected information on about 7,500 raw materials. So this isn't easy. And starting a new plan from scratch can be really overwhelming. So it's really important to approach it in an organized and focused manner. We found that many companies use 20% of their raw materials and almost 80% of their products. Focusing your efforts on high-value materials can lead to quicker results. I also think it's really important to recognize that chemical supply chains are complicated. There may be layers of suppliers before a product comes to your door. So this process can be lengthy. Each request you make to a supplier may require them to go to several of their suppliers to gather information. So getting completed data packages will require follow-up and ongoing communication. There's going to be back and forth conversation. You won't understand everything that you get back from your vendors. They may send you stuff that does not meet what you need or what you were asking for. And there will be vendors who don't understand what you're asking for. The more open your communication lines are with your vendor, the more successful you'll be. Okay, so in summary, here are my keys to developing a robust RDM system. Get buy-in from your management when you start. And I would recommend you do this by explaining why data collection is so important. And risk mitigation often speaks very loudly to executives. Make sure you get the support of all your internal staff members. So product development, sales, sourcing, they should all be on board and in the loop. You want to be on board and in the loop with them when they are bringing new chemicals into the company. It can make collection easier and more timely. Issues that arise can be communicated to the product development engineers before you get too far down that development line. And sales should know that they shouldn't take products to new markets unless you know that those products are going to new markets. Procurement also can really help you build relationships with suppliers and aid in getting information if that process that you have developed is really user-friendly. Always, always, always start out by creating that well-defined attribute list. This reduces the number of times you need to go back to your suppliers for more information. Standardize your collection process. Make it easy. Make it easy to send out to people. Make it easy for them to fill out. Make it easy for them to send back. If you can, include references for suppliers who aren't as knowledgeable about regulations. And then finally, put the information somewhere accessible. Make it easy to access and report on so that when your customers call you asking you for data and it's your turn to respond, you can access it very easily. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
How does a company like that, you can generate all the data and collect data on new raw materials, but what about changes and information coming in the door? How do you manage that?
Yeah, so for those of you online, the question was, okay, yep, that's awesome. We've gone out and collected all the information on everything we have in-house, and we have a process for new materials, but what about updates and changes? Yeah, I didn't really touch on that in this case study. They did build in a management process. One of the things, some of the solutions we found, not necessarily just for this client, but some of the solutions we found are monitoring incoming SDSs and comparing it with what you currently have on file. And if it's changed significantly, it's time to do a data collection. Some clients, they work those disclosure agreements into their purchasing agreements, and they also put in there, if you change the material, you need to tell us. Now you can put that in there all day long. That doesn't mean that they're actually going to do it, but at least you have it, and some might comply. Really, the safety data sheets are the best way. I jokingly call them the gateway drug in regulatory. So they really can tell you about things that have changed. You know, when GHS came into force in the US, we saw a shocking number of changes that people were like, oh yeah, there's this carcinogen, but it was small. So we didn't really put it on before because we didn't really think it was a carcinogen product, but our GHS, it's classified as a carcinogen. So I'm sure everybody saw that too. Stuff that they bought, all of a sudden it came with all these symbols on it that before it was like, oh, you could drink it practically. I mean, it was just like, what happened to my product? And they're like, you changed it. Nope, we didn't change it. But the requirements changed, and so now the SDS looks completely different. So yeah, maintenance is, we have some customers that they set up a 5-year maintenance schedule. So they review all of their chemicals on a 5-year period. So it just depends on your needs, what you would anticipate the changes looking like, how often you feel you need to review them. Any other questions? All right.
I think we are ready for our next talk. Lauren is our Client Services Manager 3 here at PACE, and she's been with us for 6.5 years. She currently supports all PACE regulatory service training and development with the direct management of hazard communication employees and laboratory safety employees. Lauren has a Bachelor of Science in Biology and Communication Studies. Please welcome Lauren.
So maintaining a network. Today I'm going to talk about first defining what our industry is, building a network development, and then apply it to a couple quick case studies. First, who am I? Well, Amanda gave me a fantastic technical introduction, but on the more fun side of things, I'm a kids and kinship mentor. I'm an extreme couponer for personal care products that I then donate back to that organization. I'm a Minnesota Twins fan, and I really enjoy traveling. Who are you? What do you do? I don't know about you, but that's probably my least favorite question to get asked, especially outside of industry. I can't usually just give that one-word answer that says I'm a chemist or a microbiologist. Usually when I say I work in product stewardship, I get the blank stare. So I usually follow that up with an explanation. You know when you're on a highway and you pass a truck and it has a picture on the back? I do that. Not really, and those of us inside industry know it's a lot more complicated than that, but it's a simple explanation that a lot of people can relate to. Inside of industry, I can say that I'm a manager within the regulatory services team. I specifically support groups related to product stewardship, regulatory data management, safety data sheet authoring, toxicology, trade compliance, chemical data management, and laboratory safety. You all look a little bit puzzled. That's right, because our industry is a giant puzzle, and those are the pieces to mine: claims, sustainability, life cycle, and so on. I'm sure those of us in this room are associated with product stewardship, or you might not be here today. But we all have different pieces of our puzzle, and they all form different types of connections. Our industry is extremely hard to define. It's important we understand all the different pieces, how they come together to continue to expand our network and grow within our careers. For example, let's say that your distributor isn't a piece of your puzzle. You might often have this dilemma where you're trying to seek specific information from that distributor, and you work in one state and they might work in another. So you're trying to say, well, I need the specific information because this is the state that I'm in, and they have no idea what you're talking about. It's important that you build that relationship with them. As Angela said, pick up the phone, call that distributor, explain the importance of why you need that information, how you're going to build it, and build that network to be able to add pieces to your puzzle and keep your network growing. Because generally what you're asking aren't things that you can ask Google or Siri. So how do you go about doing that? How do you go about building your network? It all starts with your current day-to-day interactions. I'm sure we all work somewhere in a career path and have coworkers around us all doing different pieces of regulatory work. Well, it's extremely important to know what our peers do. You never know when that comes a time when you might need to reach out to one of their connections, and you want to use your immediate network to grow your current network. Further, beyond utilizing your existing network, you can use professional organizations. Product Stewardship Society, Society of Chemical Hazard Communication, CTAC, SOT, AIHA, ACS. These are all professional organizations related to product stewardship. In addition, there are specific LinkedIn groups that you can join, and the universe and beyond. So now let's apply that to a couple case studies. First, after working with a known network EPA case manager, a model was needed by OHIA for a Prop 65 data statement. The EPA and OHIA are two very different agencies, but a contact was already developed with a known network EPA case manager. Solution? A recommendation was made by the EPA's case manager to a person who works with an EPA modeling for an introduction and that reference. When you have a contact inside of industry, you get more assistance, a faster response time, and help when it's not necessarily a person's job. The additional support comes from them knowing the relationship and stemming from building that trust in that relationship and knowing what a person needs. And finally, that new contact was developed for modeling that was able to help support the requests from OHIA. And secondly, additional information, including an updated SDS and additional inventory status information, was needed from a vendor. Solution? Generic websites help establish a contact, but continuing to build that relationship, continuing to ask for additional piece of information, working with that contact builds a resulting in finding stronger ways to solve a problem in the future, which leads to a process of information, a trusting and building relationship, understanding of a purpose of the request, and faster response times in the future. So I know many of us in this room are at different levels in our career path, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, but it's very important to remember that when we get to the top, it's also important to go back down. The base is the foundation, and I would argue that the base starts with our students. We're in an ever-growing industry, and I beg to differ. 20 years ago when we first got started, that many people didn't know what product stewardship was, but look how many people are in this room today and how many people you have around you. We need to bring in new candidates to our ever-growing industry to continue to get the support. And I don't know about you, but I've never heard of an undergraduate degree in product stewardship. So it's very important that we network with our students to share what our industry is to get them involved. In addition, we have very many people working at their entry-level spot in their careers. These people are often working with just a small piece of that large puzzle that I showed in the beginning. It's extremely important for them to understand the importance of their piece in the puzzle, be able to know all the networking opportunities around them, where they can go in their different career paths, so they can expand and grow and learn. And finally, even if you're an expert or an advanced, just when you think you know your job really well, the government goes and changes something and you have to start all over again. So you do want to utilize your whole chain of communication there. Again, building that existing network builds that trust, credibility, reliability, and network growth. So to recap, it's important to build a network. You have opportunities all around you, and building your network helps you, helps your peers, and helps our industry continue to be successful.
Any questions? Okay, thanks, Lauren. All right, so I think we are going to jump into our next speaker right away. We've given you a lot of time for food and drink, but if you need to get up, feel free to do so. We're here for our main event. Steve is up next. Steve, you're clapping. Steve is our senior project manager for our regulatory consulting team. He's been here at PLACE since 2011. He consults on he's a technical expert for REACH, Canadian WMIS, DSL, TSCA, OSHA, DOT, FIFRA, and so many more international chemical regulations. Steve has been in the industry for nearly 30 years and holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Iowa. Welcome, Steve.
Well, we thought we'd get you going right into TSCA before everybody else fell asleep or went home. So obviously it's a fun topic for me, but not for everyone else. So tonight I wanted to talk about the TSCA inventory active and inactive process, or as what those of us in the field call the inventory reset. And this was probably one of the most simple things that the TSCA has done under the Chemical Safety Act that went into effect in 2016, but it's so fundamental that we need to go over it, and all of us in the chemical industry really kind of need to understand where this impacts us. So going back a little bit, the new TSCA, what we call it, on June 22nd, 2016, President Obama signed into law the Schellinger Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. Big mouthful, TSCA, I've seen it abbreviated as, but basically what this did was amend what we call the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, our nation's primary chemical management regulation. The act became effective immediately upon signing, and ever since then we've been dealing with this act. There are a number of clauses that are far different in the LCSA than have been that we're used to in the regulatory field. One of the interesting things about this law is that Congress mandated timelines for EPA to comply with the act itself. So if timelines seem really advanced, or that things are pushing along very quickly, or they're very disorganized at EPA, that's because there's a mandated timeline in the law itself. Normally, Congress doesn't do that. They pass the law. They allow the regulatory agency to pass the regulation which implements the law. They didn't do that. Congress was a little bit fed up with how things were going in the TSCA, so they implemented it very, very quickly. And this is the first significant amendment to TSCA in its nearly 40-year life. And we went ahead and rewrote major sections of it. So really, we didn't change the focus of TSCA. TSCA was designed to approach risks from chemicals in a holistic rather than fragmented way. At the point in time in 1978, we had the FDA regulating pharmaceuticals, we had DOT regulating transport, but nobody was taking a look at all the chemicals that were coming into the marketplace. So Congress at the time felt it was a very good idea to evaluate all these chemicals prior to them coming on the market, and they assigned that task to EPA because they felt EPA was the only one big enough to take it on. TSCA was supposed to develop information in order to increase understanding about the toxicity of chemicals and the risks they pose. Now, this didn't happen the way that it was written in the regulation. There was a number of things, case studies, or legal cases, I should say, that prevented EPA from being able to use TSCA the way that it was intended. And TSCA would apply to the existing chemicals that were in the marketplace at the time. So they went out, they surveyed the marketplace, there was about 62,000 chemicals. That became the base inventory. We didn't go out and ask for any information on them, just is it present or absent in the marketplace. Now that list is about 86,000 chemicals in 2016, and now we're talking about resetting that inventory. So there's a pretty substantial amount of chemicals that this actually impacts. So what we did is we changed the actual law, the 40 CFR 710, of the inventory, what's required. Well, why is that important? What are we doing here? Who is it impacting? Well, it's really important for the EPA under the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act because there are a number of statutes within TSCA that key directly off of the inventory. So we'll talk about this a little bit more, but prioritization, hazard risk assessment, those all start with the inventory. So there's a lot of work that EPA was looking at, 86,000 chemicals, trying to do a hazard assessment on every single one of them. That was very, very overwhelming. It's also really important because industry is going to lose market share. There's going to be a number of CAS numbers that are not going to be active on the inventory anymore. If it's not on the active inventory, you can't sell it in commerce. Now, if it's on the inactive, there's a way to move it to the active, but that means that the TSCA inventory is essentially shrinking in size. You're not going to have 86,000 chemicals to choose from when you're developing a product. You're not going to have 86,000 chemicals that you can bring to bear to a subject matter. We don't know what we're going to need those chemicals for, but they're going to disappear. So who does TSCA really affect? And I say it affects a lot of people in a very, very, very broad chemical industry. Obviously, it affects manufacturers. Manufacturers are required to do the reporting under the inventory reset for the substances they manufactured in the last 10 years. However, they also said processors. If you take a chemical and you process it, change it, blend it, you might need to also notify if your manufacturer didn't. So processors were directly affected and written into the law. However, if you're a distributor, you sure as heck want to know that your chemical that you're selling is on the inventory, because if it's not, you're in violation of the law. Now, there's certain sections of TSCA that key right off the inventory, like imports and exports. 12B, Section 12B imports and 15 exports. So we know that those come directly from the inventory. We're changing that list now. And of course, because we're shrinking that list, we're going to impact our market, our end users. They're not going to have the availability of 86,000 chemicals or more to draw from. So this is TSCA by section. So I wanted to show you this. I'm not going to go over every section, but there's a number of sections that were really, really important here that were changed under Lautenberg. So when you hear me talking about the inventory is in section 8, reporting and retention of information, actually 8B. Now, it directly affects every section that's in blue. So imports and exports, like we just mentioned, testing of chemical substances. The test rules have been changed. Well, now you need a test rule if you're not going on the inventory. Manufacturing, processing, notices. So new chemicals. Well, you're putting a chemical on the market, you're doing a test, you bring a PMN to bring it onto that inventory. What are the requirements? That changed as well. Regulations of hazardous chemical substances, section 6 is one of the biggest ones. They completely rewrote that. It wasn't working, it was broke, so they decided to fix it. The EPA had tried to promulgate regulations banning asbestos. They kind of didn't handle that case really well. And after that, they were never effectively able to use section 6 again. Well, this is talking about existing substances. So EPA wasn't able to go back out and effectively gather information on substances that were on the TSCA inventory because they weren't able to enforce section 6. Well, they changed that rule now, and now they're talking about it in terms of, that you'll see later on, called prioritization and hazard and risk assessments. So that's been completely rewritten. Again, keys off of the inventory. So under 8B, EPA is required to, by law, compile, keep current, and publish a list of each chemical substance which is manufactured or processed in the United States. So there's going to be 85,000 chemicals in the old list. The 63,000 were grandfathered on the list without any information whatsoever. Now we're talking about that section 6, where we're going to go back and look at those, prioritize them, which ones are high risk and low risk. High risk ones are there, we need to go do risk assessment. So now that inventory is tapering down to a lot of work. So they're guessing now the new inventory, EPA last time I heard said somewhere around 45,000 substances. Well, that's a heck of a drop, it's almost half. I'm a little more optimistic, think it'll probably be more around 60, but still, we're losing a lot of substances. So the Lautenberg Act requires manufacturers, or required, I should say in the past tense because it's technically done, inventory reset in October 5th. Lautenberg Act required manufacturers and may require some processors to notify EPA of each chemical substance on the list. The manufacturer processor manufactured in the last 10-year period, so it was a look-back period. They said if you made it in the last 10 years, and you're making it now, and you want to continue to make it, you need to let us know. We'll move it from the old inventory onto what we call the active inventory. If it doesn't get moved to the active inventory, it's going to the inactive. It doesn't disappear, but it goes inactive. So you had to do a notice of activity. You had to fill out a form on EPA's website on CDX. It was very, very simple. You could do about 50 substances by cast number in probably 15 minutes if you were good with CDX. If you had any materials that you had put on the confidential TSCA inventory, it got a lot more complicated. They changed all the rules in Lautenberg about confidentiality. It wasn't, in the old system, you can simply check a box, claim everything's confidential, move along with your PMM, no information was ever released. That's not the case under Lautenberg. Now you have to justify every time you want to claim something with CBI. On the inventory reset, they said if you want to continue with that CBI claim, now you have to follow the new rule and justify your old claims. So that caused people a lot of problems. From all this information, the EPA will establish 2 lists, an active list and an inactive list based on the notification responses. So if you're on the inactive list and you want to use the substance, it's still available. You just have to fill out a notice, which is going to be called very, very confusingly Form B. So we started with Form A, it was pre-end of the date, and now once they publish the inventory, it'll be Form B to move the substance onto the active list. Basically, you've got a grace period, 90 days after they publish the list, which they haven't done yet. So to do that, anything on the list after that, you can still do this. Now, interestingly enough, the EPA had to do this notice of activity in CDX very, very quickly. They had like 6 months to figure out how to do this. They had to do it so quickly they couldn't figure out what to charge for it. So it's all free. So best bargain the EPA has ever given us. So, and it still remains free. You don't have to pay for Form A or Form B. You just have to know how to do it. So what's the difference? Well, only substances on the active inventory can be sold in commerce. That means if it's not on the active inventory, you shouldn't be selling it. And we like active out there running chemicals, making things work. Inactive substances will go to the inactive inventory, and as we say, just say no to concentrated chemicals. We like them all to be active. So if you had substances, or you have substances, check the list, make sure they get notified. You may want them later on. Well, I mentioned Section 6 and why it was so important. By law, Lautenberg said the EPA must, by law, create a process to screen new and existing chemicals as either high or low priority, and they have 9 to 12 months to put it on that prioritization list to do that process. A high priority substance they define is the EPA includes without consideration of costs or other non-risk factors, which again is a major change from the way things were stated under the old TSCA. Before you have to look at costs, least burdensome methods. Under the new TSCA, all about risk. We're going to go basically off of what risk and hazards were. So if it was posing a potential hazard, they also look at potential routes of exposure and conditions of use. This is a huge issue. Conditions of use defined by who? By you, the subscriber, the users, by EPA, by NGOs. Everybody has a different opinion of what condition of use is, and we're starting to see some of those regulations kick out on how they're handling SNRs and non-worseners, conditions of use are now being handled vastly differently in effect how a substance can be used in the marketplace. Also, in Lautenberg, we had to consider unreasonable risk to a potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulation. Say that one 5 times fast. What this means is it's not just any study that will work. The EPA has to look at all potentially exposed subpopulations, meaning children, elderly, immunocompromised individuals. If there's data available for that, that has to be addressed. And if the substance has that data, it's going to be high priority. Or substance could be determined to be a low priority, but the definition of low priority is, oh, just it's a high priority. So it automatically skews things towards being a high priority because you have to have the data to prove you're not high priority. So low priority is very, very difficult under this definition. So this is actually a picture of the process. I wanted to show you the identification of the candidate chemical. Candidate chemicals come from the inventory. So we start this whole process, 90-day public comment period, another 90-day comment period. Then we determine whether it's a high priority or a low priority. If it's high priority, it goes on. Now it goes to risk evaluation. And there's a whole bunch of steps for risk evaluation. We won't go through all of these, but this is all the things that the Congress said they had to do. And we know from dealing with EPA and risk evaluations, this isn't even half of what EPA wants to do for a risk evaluation. But they only have 3 years to do this. Each substance that gets put as a high priority, they have to, by law, do this. Well, at the outset, the real rub of this whole thing, where it gets back to the inventories, we're looking at 86,000 compounds prior to this. EPA just released these cost numbers on their new updated pricing. EPA was allowed to update pricing for the first time in probably over a decade. But they included risk evaluation data. Well, they're saying it's going to cost $3.8 million for each risk evaluation. For each high priority substance, it's going to cost $3.8 million. They're going to only charge back $1.3 million to the person who owns that substance. There's a $2.5 million difference that you and I will be paying for every substance on the inventory that may or may not have been used prior to reset. So this is the driving factor. This is why we're resetting the inventory. This is why it matters, is because we're trying to save the EPA money, and it saves us money. So that's why it's important. So how did this actually affect us when we went through this process? The cost of doing a notice of activity, generally pretty small. We dealt with some very large manufacturers, even having some of thousands of CAS numbers. Generally, it was not that expensive for them to do this process. It was actually more expensive to get the data to do the process. As some of my colleagues have mentioned before, the data mining that you needed to do to be able to answer these questions, how many CAS numbers do I have in this product, were not simple. But once you got the CAS numbers, the cost of the notice of activity was relatively small. Now, there's a small number of available substances, so we're going to actually shrink it. So there's going to be a pretty large effect once we shrink the inventory. The market is going to feel that in ways that we haven't even calculated yet. There's also going to be a cost for all of us who have gone through and looked at those safety data sheets, and you see that section 15 that says all the substances are in this product are on the TSCA inventory. Which TSCA inventory now? Is it the new one, the active list? Is it the one pre-2016? Is it an interim list? So, in essence, at some point in the very near future, once they publish the new list, we're going to need to make sure that all our safety data sheets are listing the TSCA status correctly. So, one of the other things is that because they're updating the inventory and because they updated TSCA as a whole, there's an increased cost to any new substances that you're bringing to the market. PMN, pre-manufacturer notice, is going to cost $16,000, whereas before it cost about $2,500. So that's a pretty large increase. Now that only affects companies, large businesses in excess of 93 million. Small businesses have a smaller price, but what it means is PMNs, low REXs, low volume exemption, test market exemptions, things that were low cost, low impact to research and development, to add substances to the list, now have a significant burden to developing a new product. So what was the actual process that EPA went through? There are actually two stages. By February 7th, all the manufacturers had to notify the substances that they manufactured in the last 10 years. Do a Form A for each one of those. However, processors had an additional step. So the idea was that processors would wait, see what the manufacturer put on the list, anything that they were still using that the manufacturer did notify them, they could notify. So processors had until October 5th to do that. Obviously, we were a little bit beyond October 5th. We're pushing December 5th closely more here, and we still don't have a final inventory out of EPA yet. So when we did a lot of this sort of work, we checked over a dozen companies' cost of compliance for their substances. We provided full notification A services to about half of these. And everybody says, well, you know, why so few? You know, there's all these chemical companies, all these 86,000 cats, why so few? Basically, most companies didn't consider that it affected them. They still are waiting to see that the inventory is, you know, if their substances are on the list, well, then they're going to look at it later. Or they didn't consider them a manufacturer. They said, well, we just mix chemicals. Well, this rule actually affected them as well. So the process that we used when we were doing this for our clients is very, very similar to the process that Angela has described, the process that Ben described with Prop 65. Gather data, see all this SDSs, get the CAS numbers, break everything apart, because you're going to need the CAS number to check status. Contact the vendors because you're going to have a bunch of gaps. Interpret that data versus the inventory. Interpreting the data is actually far more than just looking at the inventory list. And then implementing, what did you need to do once you find out the status of those CAS numbers? So gathering the data, well, what we found is the EPA, by and large, considered that if you knew your formula, they expected you to have 100% CAS level information. That was just the assumption. They were at times, sometimes shocked when we told them that was not the case, that most people did not have composition information to that detail. And their response was, well, you're going to have to get it. Well, that's going to take more time, but you only gave us 1 year to do this. So what we experienced was a lot of the raw material composition was very difficult to get early on. There was a lot of resistance. People, you call them up, say, hey, you pass level information. They're like, I'm not giving you my formula. Well, they need to know something. There's a lot of confusion over the TSCA inventory. So a lot of people are saying, well, it says on my safety data sheet it's TSCA listed. Which TSCA list are you looking at now? So we did a lot of, again, a lot of explaining, a lot of working with the vendors to help them understand the rule. The SCS may not give you everything. In most cases, it didn't give you everything. Remember, SCS only has to list something that's GHS hazardous. Well, what about the other composition that's not hazardous, that's composed of something? It has a CAS number, several CAS numbers. So those weren't listed, so a lot of times you have to go back and find those as well. And there's a lot of confidential composition, which required some special techniques to go back and get that sort of information. Vendor follow-up, vendor follow-up, vendor follow-up. Contacting the vendors for full composition. We contacted them, asked them for the status. And as Angela pointed out very clearly, you can't do this in form. It just did not work. We tried, we would get very few results. And undoubtedly, when a client came to us and said, we want you to do a verification of our product for TSCA status, it wasn't because they were wanting to do that themselves, it's because their clients were telling them they needed to know. So we didn't have 6 months or a year to wait for people to get around to this. So we had to work with them to try to find a more rapid solution that included explaining the rule, why we're doing it, who we are, who we're working for. Verifications in writing, as Angela said, we try to get full composition first, then we would move to a verification step. The EPA had issued rules about this and said, hey, if you're going to tell people downstream that you've notified your material, you need to give them the CGX receipt. Yeah, that didn't work either. EPA thought this was a great solution. We'll send out a blank number that just says your substance has been notified. Well, the problem was it was designed to be confidential. So you just got a number that didn't mean anything. If you did 50 of them, you got 50 numbers, and you couldn't even link them back to which substance you listed. So even yourself, you couldn't track what you were doing. I had this problem myself. many times. So even getting a CDX receipt, really, you could use the same CDX receipt for every single substance you had, and nobody would know the difference, because there's no way for us to track them. The only people who could track what a CDX receipt was for was EPA. And even them, when I had to go back for several of these, they couldn't break them down. It took them a week for their IT department to get to what the actual substance was. So that was very much a challenge. So we very, very rarely receive CDX receipts. So the value of a CDX receipt is primarily that somebody has it, that it has been done. However, transmitting it down the supply chain didn't have the value that the EPA thought it would. So that didn't make the process easier. So getting back to that, the verification in writing now moves up that scale as importance. You have to get some sort of verification. I can't get the CAS numbers, or you can't get the CAS numbers. Can you verify, or your supplier verify for us that this is on and has been notified on the new active list? So usually we create a letter. We spend a lot of time explaining what the rule is, who we are, why we're concerned about this, and then ask them to tell us about your product, what the CAS numbers were, what you're doing with it. Is it on the active list? Are you going to put it on the active list? There were a number of people who just weren't going to notify. Like, nope, that's not our problem. In which case, it's fine. We just needed to know. Interestingly enough, we got to use our own clients a lot of times to help prioritize these responses. A lot of people didn't want to respond until they knew why we were doing this. Our client could go back and say, hey, I'm buying 50,000 pounds of this stuff. I want to know what this response is. That was a lot more motivating. Didn't help speed the process, but it was a very factual thing that happened. So once we got these, how do we interpret them? Well, basically we were supposed to be running these versus what's called the interim and exempt list. The exempt list was basically everything that the EPA had looked at in some way, shape, or form in the past 10 years. So this primarily meant CDR responses. So chemical data reporting is part of the TSCA that is supposed to help update the information that the EPA had on substances on the inventory. So if they had responded to a CDR request in the last 10 years, that was considered the same as doing the Form A notification. Well, the problem with that is, if any of you have done CDR reporting, the CDR has changed its volume requirements for what you had to report every time they've done it in the last 15 years. So if it started off 100,000 pounds or more, you had to notify. And it went down to 50,000 last week. A couple of times it's been 25,000 pounds. That's still left a lot of volume that wasn't being notified. So just because something was on the exempt list, that was a good indication that somebody had done the notification, but not the reverse. The interim list was everything that had been notified up by manufacturers up to somewhere around the end of February. EPA would publish these interim lists, and you add the interim list to the exempt list, and get sort of a total list of things that had been notified or were exempt. Now, they hadn't published another one since March because they figured we would be all done with this by the end of October, so what was the point? Well, now we're still waiting for the final list. Now, I did talk to EPA today, and their response was soon. Helpful, as always. But I did a little prying, and they said, well, we've got our side done. We've got the list ready. It's just waiting for something. And they wouldn't tell us what, but that probably means two things. Either we're waiting for something on budget, general accounting, or they're waiting for something from the White House, which we've known the White House hasn't been a big fan of EPA on these things. So somehow that might all be tying in. We can't figure out exactly why, but they're waiting. They have a list. It should come once they get the authorization. What we found in interpreting this data was the raw material composition was still difficult to get. Even when you thought you had it, a lot of times it wasn't correct. There's a lot of still confusion. People would send us the wrong information, and now we're trying to interpret it, figure out where they made their mistakes. The SCSs didn't give us everything, so we still had to go back, try to find more information. Confidential composition required a lot more work. If the people were putting things confidential, they really didn't want to go back and verify either early on. As we got closer to the deadline, September, October, then we got a lot more of the confidential responses. One of the major things we found was resolving all the CAS numbers. It wasn't as simple as just putting a CAS number in a search engine and saying, oh, look, it's on the inventory list. A lot of times you would find things that had CAS numbers that didn't necessarily correspond to things that were on the TSCA inventory. Why not? What does that mean? Is it confidential? If it's confidential, then I have to follow up more. If it's a polymer, why is it on the inventory? If it's exempt, polymers can be exempt or not exempt. So we have to figure out what that reasoning was. We had a lot of issues with import materials where we get a CAS number, there being no US manufacturer. So the foreign manufacturer should theoretically be doing the notification, but they don't have any interest in that. They're like, you've already done everything. I don't know what you're talking about. Trying to get them to get on board to do the notification, to give us, CAS numbers so we could do the notification was difficult. You could do a process where you did it's called a joint notification, where you notify them and they would go do their side and we would do our side. That didn't work well. It was really funky. Most of the importers, exporters, foreign manufacturers would receive these notifications and have no idea what you're talking about. So then you start the process over, education, going through the letters and everything again, we go back all through it. We also found a lot of times we get CAS numbers and they wouldn't show up in the substance registry system, which is EPA's version of the possible list, and making sure things were registered. You go in and type in a number, it's not in there, but what's going on? It's not on the TSCA inventory. Well, shoot, we've been selling that for 20 years. It's not on the TSCA inventory, now you've got a problem. And what we usually find out, it was some form of UBCD. Like gasoline is an example I always use. Gasoline has one CAS number that's registered on most of the world inventories, but it's actually composed of up to 20 different CAS numbers. If somebody gives you one of those 20 CAS numbers and not the primary one, a lot of those may turn up as missing on the inventories, but they're covered under a major family CAS number name. So, but you have to figure this out retroactively from a single CAS number, which usually a lot of times didn't give you a lot to go with. So the result was, we had to do the active inventory, substances on the inactive inventory must be notified prior to sale. So if you're not on the active or the inactive, you have to do a PMN, which is basically a new substance notification. In the end, we notified or did searches on about 5,000 CAS numbers. We filed about 34 main notices, about 150 substances total. Now, moving forward, there's a couple of things that we would recommend. Sorry about that. Check the TSCA status for all the new materials you get. Look for the new inventory status. Don't just accept TSCA inventory approved. I'm sure all your existing materials are on the TSCA inventory. And we recommend that you put a statement on your safety data sheets that clearly denotes when and where you did your TSCA inventory search. So this one was taken mid-October, so they're still talking about the Form A's and Form Notices of the commencement and the interim lists and things like that. But in the end, you want to be able to differentiate your safety data sheets that will save your regulatory team, that will save your customer's regulatory teams a lot of questions when you can say, my substances that are supplied in this product are on the active inventory as of hopefully November 2018, but that's what we're looking for. Also, while you're there, be on the lookout for the new Wattenberg Chemical Safety Act effects on your chemicals that you use. SNRs are not the same thing that they used to be. You're seeing a lot more of them, and they're showing up in safety data sheets. EPA, I think they issued between now and August 151 new substances, 131 issued with SNRs. Now, those SNRs are not like they used to be, where you're banned from selling them because you can't release the water, only 2 parts per billion or something like that. A lot of these are SNRs based around safety. So they've gotten into the market of telling you in a SNR that your product now has to contain a certain level of protective equipment on the safety data sheet. So EPA is now dictating things that go into the safety data sheet as a safety sign. So that's not really a terrible restriction. However, their standards are quite high. And what you see is they did this because a lot of information was coming back on respiratory irritants with polymers. So they couldn't just go out and do a Section 4 test rule because that's requiring somebody now to spend $23,000 on air testing. So they went ahead and said, we'll just give you a snare and say that you have to use protective equipment up to an APR of 1,000, which basically means you're wearing a self-contained breathing apparatus. So it really helps your sales. I'm just saying, you know, you really have that extra thing. So be careful about that now. You have to see those things. They're also issuing what's called non-order snares. So your product goes through the whole review process. You go on the inventory, but you have a snare that basically says that the use is not specifically outlined in the PMN. That will require them to write a snare, a non-order snare. So only the uses in your PMN are covered. Anything else is considered a new use. It has to be evaluated. That evaluation has to be written in the form of a snare, which can take months or years to write, and you can't sell into that market until that snare is written for that new use. SNUDs, the uses are very similar. So in other words, keep looking at your safety data sheets, toss the inventory reset. Hopefully will be wrapped up soon, but you're going to see a lot of these effects coming down in the next year, 2 to 3 years. Moving on. Prioritization process is scheduled to do out for the next, I think, 15 or 20 years. They have a mandatory 20 substances minimum to do reviews on, and they have to do a certain number of really high hazard ones first, so we know they're going to have issues with that. But that's all I have on the inventory reset, and I guarantee you that the components of this presentation are not listed on the active NRM list, so you're okay. No problems. Questions? If you have more questions, feel free. Do I anticipate a lot of companies coming to us after the list is published? Yes, I do. If it's anything similar to what we saw with Proposition 65, we'll get more activity or more interest after the rule publishes, the inventory publishes, and everybody goes, oh, nobody picked up our substance. What do we do? I have a feeling that's going to be far more common. This is what happened in Prop 65. Nobody was concerned, or at least a lot of the article manufacturers weren't concerned about Prop 65 until their suppliers or their purchasers said, hey, we need Prop 65 statement. Like, what do we do with that? So now they're coming back trying to figure out Prop 65 after it went into effect. Just judging in general from the way that the market responded to this, most of the chemical companies, larger chemical companies, they seem to be more on top of it. Small and medium-sized enterprises really didn't know what to do, nor were they generally familiar enough with the process in CDX to do the notifications. So I highly suspect there was some more activity on this. Yes, Peter.
So if these non-order snares are mandating things like personal protective equipment and stuff like that,
yes,
isn't that really something that would be covered under OSHA rather than EPA?
You're correct. The non-order snares, if they're starting to dictate personal protective equipment, that is getting into the realm of OSHA. That's one of the things that was kind of outlined in the Chemical Safety Act, is that there were going to be places where they were going to need to work directly with OSHA to do these types of restrictions. Now, I think OSHA's pretty much said, okay, go ahead, do these requirements. But I have not seen any letters of agreement which normally take place. So the question becomes, is OSHA and EPA have some of the history with turf wars on this sort of thing dating back to the 70s and 80s. So is that going to come up again? It's possible, but I think because the way the regulation is, or the legislation is written, that they're kind of mandated to work together on this. But yeah, when you go to OSHA and talk to them about this, they're like, we don't have any idea what you're talking about. So it's really, they're using all the EPA-based terminology in these snares and zones to dictate the conditions of protective equipment, releases, and things like that that are being put in safety data sheets. So. Did I do okay for time? You did great.
Question just came in, just like literally this second. I don't know if it'd be easier for you to read it right here.
The supplier refuses to confirm that all of the components' confidential trade secrets are listed as active on the top spec inventory or is exempt. is the final resort to deselect the vendor. Or, well, there's a couple of things. If a supplier has a confidential composition, they are required to at least disclose the disposition of the materials on the TSCA inventory. However, we know that that always doesn't happen. Ultimately, and I've asked EPA about this, what's the ultimate fallback position on this? And they're saying, well, you should turn them over to us for enforcement. And my follow-up question is, how much enforcement are you going to be doing on this? I said, well, no enforcement unless you turn something over. So, so that's kind of the way EPA is dealing with this. They're not going to have 1,000 inspectors going out looking for your cost of satisfying products. However, if it comes up in a situation like this, I do know that the one inspector I talked to said that they would intervene directly and work as an intermediate in that case. So, all right, we'll get you out of here early.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for everyone for coming. We really appreciate you being here. We'll all be sticking around for a little bit after. If you come up with any additional questions, just hunt us down and ask. Otherwise, have a great evening.